So the world's billionaires and even US presidents are absolutely obsessed by two books written in the 1990s that made some unbelievable predictions about things that would happen between the years 2006 and 2030 that have all come true since these 1990s books were written.
So this book in 1991 says in 2020 we're going to have this giant crisis, but in the fourth turning, it's even more specific. Here are some of the prophecies that were there as we go to introduce it. That there'll be, 25 years ago, there'll be a global terrorist group that blows up an aircraft. There'll be an impasse of federal budgets that reaches a stalemate with a government shutdown. There'll be anarchy within the former Soviet Republic, and Russia is going to conduct training exercise on its borders. And the CDC is going to announce a new communicable virus that could take down the world.
So that, of course, was billionaire Tony Robbins talking about two books that were both co-authored by the one and the only Neil Howe. And, of course, he is coming out with his third book, being released in exactly 2 days, and it is titled The Fourth Turning Has Arrived. And like his 1990s books, it has some amazing predictions and prophecies for what he believes is going to unfold in the coming days and years. And I'm going to do a massive deep dive on Neil Howe's new book that's been released in exactly 2 days. I'm going to summarize that entire thing for you guys because it's very important that we pay a lot of attention to everything Neil Howe says, because he has been absolutely prophetic with his predictions of things that have transpired 3 decades in the future. We even have US vice presidents such as Al Gore say that his book Generations, written in 1991, was one of the most stimulating books he has ever read. Okay, that is a US vice president. And Neil Howe is even famous for popularizing the terms the silent generation and the GI generation. Okay, so he is a world famous demographer, and his predictions are absolutely prophetic. Now, how did these two books make such prophetic predictions about the future 3 decades in advance? Well, let's hear it from the co-author of these two books himself, who of course is Neil Howe. And in this video, he explains what his 80-year fourth turning cycle is and how it is able to predict large revolutionary wars or a crisis every 90 years.
The Glorious Revolution, and there was an enormous rebellion in the colonies too. It all happened in the 1670s, 1680s. That was the first enormous crisis in American history. And then about 80, 90 years later, we had the American Revolution. 80, 90 years later, we had the Civil War.
Yes.
And then 80 or 90 years later, the Great Depression, World War II. 80 or 90 years later, guess what? We're right here. We're right here, and we started with the GFC. And you're right, recent crises have started with economic downturns, and then they later proceed to other kind of system breakdowns. And finally, toward the climax of the crisis, you suddenly decide, the leadership decides, the entire community decides, you have to remake everything.
So some people have criticized Neil Howe's thesis, but all he does is he points out the fact that human progress and civilizational progress does not occur in a linear fashion. It goes through cycles. We go through booms and busts. We go through periods of war and peace. We go through periods of feast and famine. But I want to first mention the fact that this book and this cycle that we are going to analyze in depth today is very important, because it is going to give us clues about how the US empire cycle is going to unfold. And it is also going to give us clues why we have these global reserve currency transitions that seem to happen every 100 years, where we watch an empire rise and we watch an empire fall. And we can see here by this chart that it's looking at empire cycles that's done by Ray Dalio. These periods of clashing between the rising empire and the declining empire seem to happen in around 10 to 20 year periods. And again, that 20-year period is going to be very important for when we analyze what a fourth turning actually is. And that's all the authors of the book are saying. We are living in a 20-year period of extreme change, and things are going to change very quickly. As this amazing quote by Vladimir Lenin puts it, there are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen. And that is exactly what explains all of the carnage we have seen in our world over the past 3 years, in particular since 2020. People are beginning to wake up to the fact that we distrust our institutions, especially our monetary institutions, and in particular our mainstream media institutions, and we want change. That is what the fourth turning is. So let's actually get into into diving into what the fourth turning is and how it relates to these 250-year empire cycles, and of course, what their new book predicts that is being released in exactly 2 days, and how Bitcoin fits into this global fourth turning cycle. So let's start breaking down what this 90-year fourth turning cycle is and how it relates to this 250-year empire cycle. So when we look back throughout history, we can see that every empire over the past 2,500 years has lasted around 250 years. What's significant about that number 250? Well, it's about 3 times the average lifespan of an average human. So on average, we live for around 80 years, and 3 times 80 is 240 years. This is actually fascinating, and we're going to talk a little bit more about the 250-year cycle a little bit later on, and how it is influenced by these 3 80-year fourth turning cycles that happen within it. But let's start breaking down what a fourth turning actually is. So the authors of the book actually say, hey, within each of these 80-year cycles, let's break it down into 4 different 20-year segments. And they call each one of these segments a turn-in. So the first 20 years of that cycle is the first turn-in, the next 20 years is the second turn-in, and so on. And the fourth turn-in, or the last 20 years of this fourth turning cycle, is when all the chaos happens. This is when all the wars happen. This is where all of the populism rises up. This is where all the Hitlers and Mussolinis come to power. And it's absolutely amazing how accurate this cycle has been if you look at the past 500 years. So let's take a look at 4 of the biggest wars and times of revolution that has occurred in the United States over the past 400 years. So we can see in the late 1700s, we obviously have the Revolutionary War, and we have the French and the Indian War. And if you go 90 years forward to around the late 1800s, of course, we had the Mexican War and the Civil War in the United States. Now, what happens if you go 90 years forward? Where does that take you to? Well, it lands you around that 1930s, 1940s time frame. What happened? Of course, we had 2 world wars. We had World War I, World War II, and we saw an enormous wave of populism, okay? So the people in Europe actually elected Hitler as well as Mussolini, and even in America, we had FDR emerge with his brand new deal that turned America into a little bit of a socialist state. We can explore that a little bit later on into today's video. But if you go 90 years forward from the 1930s and 1940s time frame, where does that put you? When is our next fourth turn-in or period of crisis, as the authors put it? It's happening today, okay? It's from between 2005 and 2030. And that is exactly what the authors predicted in the book. They said between the years 2005 and 2026 was the exact year they mentioned, you're going to see economic crisis. You're going to see America become more divided than it has been for the past 90 years. And you're going to see people demand that the institutions be torn down and rebuilt because they lose faith in these institutions that begin to fail them. Unbelievable predictions, because this again was written in 1997, and that is exactly what we've seen since 2005. We saw the global financial crisis in 2008, and we haven't even begun to see the end of this 90-year fourth turning cycle. Now, we are going to talk a little bit more about what the authors predict for this fourth turning cycle and how it is going to end, because all of these previous fourth turning cycles do end in war. So we're going to get into talking about that a little bit later on, but I want to first talk about the meat and the potatoes of this fourth turning thesis. Why do we have these fourth turnings every 90 years? Why does this cycle continue to happen? The authors make the case it's because of us. Okay, the authors say that it is our generations that shape history, and then the history that our generations live through influence history. Okay, so it all goes back to that amazing quote. A lot of you guys might have heard it. So this is my favorite quote, and it goes, "Hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men. Weak men create hard times." And the cycle starts all over again. So notice each one of those 4 chapters is a 20-year turning in this fourth turning cycle. So let's start diving down what each one of these generations are that are associated with each turning, okay? And this actually makes a lot of sense. At first glance, I looked at this book and I read it and I was kind of like, hey, this doesn't make a lot of sense. But the more you sit with this material, the more sense it actually makes. For example, if you and all of your peers grow up during a time of war and crisis, you are raised very differently by your parents. And on the flip side, if you're raised during a second or a third turn-in and everything's peaceful, everybody trusts their institutions, you are brought up very differently, okay? Your parents are more relaxed and you actually have a different attitude or archetype, as the authors of the book put it. So the authors of the book actually say there are 4 different archetypes, and they say that each kind of person that is born and raised in either the first, second, third, or fourth turn-in is given a different name. So for example, let's start at the fourth turn-in, or the crisis point. So the fourth turn-in is that 22-year window in time where there is major crisis, there is major political upheaval, the mood is ripe for change, and the everyday people want more order. They want to tear down the institutions that have failed them over the previous decades, and they want to build new institutions, okay? A lot of this mood is born out of the fact that wealth concentration seems to be at extremes every 80 years. So this is interesting because I believe this 90-year fourth turn-in cycle kind of intertwines with the 80-year long-term debt cycle. This amazing chart here by Ray Dalio actually shows that wealth concentration today in the US has not been this extreme since 80 years ago, the previous fourth turn-in in the 1930s and the 1940s. So this is something Neil Howe really likes to emphasize, okay? He says the mood has to be right for people to actually create change, okay? We see catalysts all the time, but they don't normally end in massive wars because sometimes the people are just too content with life, okay? Massive wars and massive revolutions don't typically happen in what Neil Howe calls the first, second, or the third turn-ins of this 90-year cycle. They always happen in the fourth turn-in where the people are fed up, okay? Think about the 1770s American Revolution. They went to war over a 2% tax on tea by the British. Or even think about the 1930s fourth turn-in and the rise of Hitler and the Nazis. The Nazis only had a 2% approval rating before the hyperinflation, but when everybody lost their entire life savings, they wanted to make significant change, and they even voted in a ruler like Hitler who promised that kind of change. And what's really interesting about these 20-year windows in time is everything is remade. So that in particular is talking about the political structures, okay? And the politicians can see the change in mood and the change in tide in society. And typically they actually lean into this crisis and this mood change, and they try to divide the public even more. It goes back to this amazing quote, divide and you can conquer, okay? And the politicians see this. They say, okay, the people want significant change. If I want to remain in power, I need to somehow distract them or somehow tell the people that that person's the reason for why they're so disgruntled and feel so poor in today's society. So that is obviously where you get the mainstream media talking about all sorts of things that the mainstream media should not be talking about. And everybody is ignoring the $900 trillion elephant in the room. And that is the fact that the money is broken. We're going to talk a little bit more about the money a little bit later, but I want to talk about each of these 4 turn-ins really quickly for you guys. So the authors say we're about to see a repeat of the 1929 to 1945 fourth turn-in. Of course, we saw that 1929 stock market crash. We saw Hitler, Mussolini rise up. Of course, we also saw World War II, and we did not see a resolution to that fourth turn-in until we completely remade society. And we do that in the first turn-in. So typically the authors say the fourth turn-in, the crisis period, ends in a big war. So that was World War II. And they say our fourth turn-in today that we're going through is not going to end until we go through a war. So the way to think about these wars is they reset everything, okay? They kind of tilt the game board, so to say, and they redistribute the chips or they redistribute the wealth a little bit more evenly in society, and society's a little bit more happy with things, okay? Look at what happened after World War II. We saw new institutions built. We saw old ones ripped down, and we saw the World Bank, the IMF, the Bretton Woods Agreement in 1944. We saw a new everything, new institutions, and people were happy. So that's why the authors call the first turn-in the high, okay? Everybody is happy. There's lots of social cohesion. There's very low crime rates. And generally, the society is very collectivized, but they're very happy. So looking back to that previous fourth turn-in where we saw all of these new institutions built up, we also saw the beginning of the civil rights movement. And of course, everybody was very optimistic about economic growth post that World War II era, okay? Everybody was sick of crisis. They wanted to coalesce with each other, so to say. And that takes us into the second turn-in, okay? After we have 20 years of peace and, very strict, collectivist ideology, everybody's all in this together and very happy after that post-World War era, we we enter something called the second turn-in, and this is actually called the awakening. And this is very interesting because the authors of the book say that in a second turn-in, everybody's a little bit sick of that 20-year period of very strict order and collectivized society, and the individual wants to actually seek out a little bit more individualism. So this is where in the 1960s and 1970s, we saw the massive cultural revolution in the United States. We saw the Great Awakening, so to say, and we can all remember the pictures of the hippies at Woodstock and all of these music festival movements. The people kind of push back a little bit and they say, hey, let's remake the internal world, okay? So in the fourth turn-ins, the external world gets remade. So new institutions, new monetary agreements, all of that, okay? But in the second turn-ins, in the awakenings, the authors of the book say that we kind of go through an internal awakening or an internal reconstruction of what is going on in the world. So after we've been living in the second turn-in for around 20 years, slowly society begins to decay and the culture begins to get a little bit erratic. And naturally, people who've kind of grown up in that hippie era, they forget all of the hard work that you need to actually go through to create the good times, okay? So the good times of the second turn-in slowly create the weak men of the third turn-in. And all of these large institutions do slowly decay. So think about what we saw in the 1980s, 90s, and early 2000s. We saw the erosion of the gold standard in 1971, and slowly but surely in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, we saw extra credit being created in society. You know what we say? Easy money leads to easy incentives, and society begins to decay when you break the money. It's as simple as that. And we also saw things such as the cultural wars in the 1980s and 1990s. People were slowly starting to have enough, so to say. Wealth inequality also started to widen in the 1980s and the 1990s as we did decay those previous institutions, like the Bretton Woods Agreement that said that a US dollar would be redeemable for gold. But you know, 1971 came along and that agreement was absolutely thrown out the window, so to say. So the third turn-in really does set the tide for the crisis era, and the mood slowly and surely becomes a little bit more annoyed with the current state of things, but it's not quite ready to react to a crisis in war. Again, big events or crises happen all the time in the first turn-in, second turn-in, third turn-in, and the fourth turn-in. But the fourth turn-in says that you're far more likely to go to war or create a massive revolution to a crisis or a catalyst that occurs in the fourth turn-in because the mood is right for change. The people have had enough and they want a new institution. A good example of that is the war in the Middle East in the early 2000s. Nobody really wanted to go to war with Afghanistan in the early 2000s, okay? The media had to lie to us and say that there was weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East, which has now proven to be absolutely false and a lie, just to kind of convince the people to go to war in the early 2000s. Another example of this happened when the stock market crashed in the year 2000. We saw that massive internet stock bubble that crashed. I think the NASDAQ lost like over 90% of its value in those 2 years following 2000, but nobody really cared. Nobody really cared about the bailout of long-term capital management in 1998, where the taxpayer essentially footed the bill for that one as well. People weren't really in the mood to get out there and revolt like they did in the aftermath of the 2008 global financial crisis. By that stage, by 2008, we were well and truly in the fourth turn-in, and the mood was right for change. So that is essentially the 4 seasons of life. That is the first, second, third, and fourth turn-ins. And the authors also delve into great detail into the book about how each of these turn-ins influence the generations that are born in each of these times. We're going to only briefly hit on it in today's video because this one's already running a little bit long, but the authors say that there are 4 different archetypes or generational types that are born in each of these turn-ins, okay? And naturally, this influences the cycles, okay? So the authors say that history shapes generations and then generations shape history, okay? The authors say that we are the ones who are causing these fourth turning cycles that are coincidentally around 80 years long in length. And that is the length of a human life cycle. So it's really interesting. So the authors say that these 4 archetypes, of course, are the hero archetype, the artist archetype, the prophet archetype, and the nomad archetype. Now, they say that a person born in the fourth turning or the crisis era, they actually call them an artist archetype. So if you are born after 2005 to present day, you are officially an artist archetype, and that means you are born in the crisis. And the same thing for people born between the years 1929 and 1945. You are born in a crisis era, and naturally you are influenced by the time that you are growing up in. So the authors of the book say that the artist archetype are typically overprotected. They're a little bit sensitive because their parents are trying to protect them from the war and the crisis that is going on around them. And naturally, this is interesting because in the third turning and the fourth turning, these people that are born in the crisis era, naturally they're, 50, 60, 70 years old, and they typically actually provide the younger generations a little bit of wisdom and a little bit of guidance to get through the fourth turning. Again, this is really interesting because it is the history that shapes generations and the generations that shape history. So that's the artist archetype, and they are born in the crisis. And the archetype that is born in the first turning when everything is good, they have a different name. They are called the prophet archetype. So the prophet archetype naturally grows up in a very optimistic era, okay? They're born in the first turning after the crisis, and they only know about good times. They only feel good times. They kind of come of age in the whole cultural revolution and the consciousness revolution. And naturally, the authors of the book kind of say that they help to also guide future generations in the third and the fourth turnings. Now, what about the people born in the third turnings? What are they called? So the nomad archetype, they're the ones that are born in the cultural revolution or the second turning. That's the awakening or the internal revolution. And naturally, they're actually a little bit underprotected, okay? So they're neglected as children, which is very different to the kids born in the fourth turning crisis. So again, the fact that these guys are kind of neglected and underprotected strengthens them a little bit, and is going to harden them for the unraveling and the fourth turnings. So again, notice how these cycles do actually change the character of each person or each archetypal generation that is born in each of these turnings. The last one I want to quickly show you guys is the hero generation. So they are born in the third turning or the unraveling. So that is essentially anyone born between 1982 and 2004. You are known as a hero generation. So these guys actually grow up during the unraveling and during the crisis era. And the hero generation are the generation that leads the change in the fourth turning. So they're very kind of action oriented, and they're the ones that really take charge in the fourth turning crisis. So that is the four turnings, and that is the four archetypes who are kind of born out of this fourth turning cycle. But what predictions can we make about the future? And what predictions do the authors make about the future? Well, they actually predict that this fourth turning is going to end somewhere around in the late 2020s or 2030s, depending upon what time frame you use for your fourth turning. Some people say it's 2005 to 2027. Some people say it's 2008 to 2030. Again, this isn't an exact science. It's a little bit of a rough framework. But I think it's really interesting that the late 2020s or the 20s wants change. They want order. They want new order. They want to disrupt the old institutions, okay? So the authors say that the fourth turning is probably going to end in war, and we're going to collectivize as a community. And this is where I actually disagree with the authors. I actually believe technology is a bigger driver than these generational shifts that we are living through today, okay? In each of these prior fourth turnings, the technology actually favored centralization and the nation state. So naturally, every time that the people would want to tear down institutions, we would simply rebuild institutions that were once again corruptible, okay? The IMF, the Bretton Woods Agreement, the World Bank, they're all centralized institutions. I actually think that we are going to build decentralized institutions at the end of this fourth turning cycle, and something has fundamentally changed. For the first time in 10,000 years, technology is actually decentralizing. Think about each of the big revolutions or kind of changes that has happened to human organization in the past 10,000 years. 10,000 years ago, we had the agricultural revolution. So we were hunters and gatherers before then in tribes, and we centralized into farms and, cottages, and we kind of lived under monarchies and all sorts of different governance structures. But it was a step in centralization. And then what happened in the 1770s? We saw the industrial revolution. And again, that took us from, farms and cottages into big, large mega cities. So it further centralized civilization. And it once again demanded that we had a social organizational structure that was able to properly scale for this increased population in a larger centralized locality. But for the first time in 10,000 years, the technology is changing and we are actually at the midst of a decentralized revolution. Think about it. We have decentralized money, we have decentralized communications, we have decentralized encrypting technologies, we even have the ability to print our own guns, okay? Anybody around the world can now 3D print their own guns. So this significantly changes the power dynamic that I believe we are going to see between the individuals and the nation state. And this gets us into another very interesting book written in the 1990s called The Sovereign Individual. And they also made some absolutely prophetic predictions about the future, like the fourth turning did. So when money is debasable, society is debasable. And another reason that society is kind of decaying right now is the fact that we're not only living through the conclusion of a 90-year fourth turning cycle, we are also living through the conclusion and transition of many other cycles around the world today. So we're at the end of an 80-year long-term debt cycle, 250-year revolutionary cycle, 250-year empire cycle, which of course is why everybody's claiming the US is in a period of decline right now. And we are also entering the digital age. We are transitioning from industrial societies to information societies for the first time in 250 years. And I want to mention all of this because it helps to explain why the world is so crazy today, okay? The fourth turning is not a doom and a gloomy kind of book. Yes, it predicts that we're in a period of crisis and significant change, and it helps to explain all of that. But it also says, hey, you know, we are going to transition to better times if we do things correctly. And this is where I do kind of disagree with the authors of the book a little bit. They claim that we need to collectivize to build new institutions, but I don't think we should be building new institutions that will probably be centralized. In times of crisis and fourth turnings, people do what people normally do, and that is innovate. They create inventions, okay? Most people have heard of the saying, necessity breeds innovation. And looking back to the previous fourth turning, what happened? Well, innovations such as the personal computer greatly got accelerated, as well as the creation of the atom, okay? Well, the atom wasn't created in the 1940s. It was actually just harnessed to create nuclear power, a nuclear bomb, okay? So two big inventions that transformed energy around the world. Most people might be thinking, the personal computer, how does that transform energy? Well, the personal computer is actually taking physical stuff or physical information and transmitting that online digitally, okay? You can kind of think of that as transforming energy or transforming the state of energy. But I think something really interesting is happening today that parallels the 1940s. The nuclear bomb and the computer were kind of used to end World War II. And I believe something similar is happening today. Bitcoin, what I believe is the technology that has been invented out of necessity, has been created. And I think it is going to actually help to unwind a lot of these cycles and help to kind of navigate the individual through the transition of all the cycles we are living in today. So to help explain this a little bit better, I'm going to actually read you a quote from one of my favorite articles I've ever written. I wrote this puppy way back in 2021 before I had any jobs in the Bitcoin space. And I was looking at all of these converging cycles we are living through today. So I say here, technology. With the emergence of technology, the cycle that emerges on the other side of this transitionary phase has the potential to end all cycles and actually become a forever cycle that significantly alters the future progress of our civilization. Two very stark contrasting futures await us on the other side of this transition in the cycle that'll end all cycles. So I actually named that little article series Bitcoin, the Big Bang that ends all cycles. And I was speculating that it's either Bitcoin or slavery in the digital age. Technology, for the first time in the past 500 years of data, is going to change the fourth turning. Today, we actually have the option to build a decentralized institution that cannot be decayed or attacked or torn down in these 80-year cycles. Think about it for a minute. I mean, Bitcoin is absolutely incorruptible. 21 million Bitcoins, you can never change the rules. We saw this in 2017. The rich tried to change the rules in Bitcoin. They failed. The big blockers failed. They've lost 99.9% of their value. And we saw a similar thing earlier in the year. We have these people like Greenpeace being bribed $5 million by people like Chris Larsen, the co-founder of Ripple, to try to change the code of Bitcoin. And guess what? They failed. You cannot change Bitcoin. It is incorruptible, which really actually makes us ask the question, can Bitcoin actually break all of these cycles forever and become the institution or the social organizational method that actually remains stable and is able to actually give our civilization eternal progress into the future without these boom and bust cycles? I think it certainly could. I want to play a really great clip from the one and the only Brandon Quittem, who has done some amazing work on Bitcoin and the fourth turning in the past, which I have learned a lot from myself. So I'm going to play that clip for you right now.
And so in those situations, money lasts, let's say 50 years, maybe 30 years if, things are going well. And I think Bitcoin has a chance to not be a 50-year money. I think Bitcoin's the first chance of being a 500-year money because it can evolve and adapt. And it doesn't mean that Bitcoin won't fail, but it does mean that this is the first potential money to last 500 years, right? Let's 10x the average or maybe more.
There you have it. I think Bitcoin is going to be 500-year money. I think it can be completely different, okay? And it can kind of revert our civilization back to the mean or back to normality, okay? Our money should actually reflect energy. Since 1971, when we got depegged from the gold standard, money has just become more and more of an illusion, okay? And it's reflected reality less and less the more years that we have kind of gone down this fiat era path. And I think the creation of Bitcoin is actually a lot bigger than most people think. We're probably going to get into that in another video, but I think the creation of energy money is absolutely massive. I'm going to read you another quick quote from that same article I wrote in 2021. And it actually says, the history of civilization is filled with the endless cycles of monetary debasement, which creates these perpetuating cycles of freedom, oppression, and then revolution. Human history is muddied by the bloody waters of revolutions and economic depressions. The great Henry Ford envisioned how a currency tied to energy would have the potential to end wars, and he actually predicted this in 1921, over 100 years ago. So that's what I believe Bitcoin is. It is energy money, like Henry Ford said, and it is going to actually end wars. If you want to actually see a video on energy money, and if you want me to do a video on that, let me know in the comments down below. I recently did do a tweet thread over on Twitter talking about the 5 men who predicted Bitcoin more than 5 decades before Bitcoin got created. The oldest prediction obviously being Nikola Tesla in the 1890s, writing about an energy-backed money. So let me know in the comments down below if you want to see that. But let's talk a little bit more about Bitcoin and why it could actually be the Noah's Ark of money and save civilization from the flood of fiat that I believe is only going to continue to get worse in years to come. The book also predicted that the nation state would fall because of this decentralized technology that is actually proliferating the globe today. Okay, this is changing the power balance. And the book predicts that nation states around the world will slowly actually realize this, and they will change the way they treat their citizens. Okay, when the citizens have their ability to store their wealth independently away from the state, naturally the state has to actually start competing to get some of that capital. No longer can the state just simply tax the citizens 50% of their income because they've got nowhere to hide it. Now with Bitcoin and other decentralized encrypting technologies, we have the ability to hide our wealth away from the state so it can no longer steal our wealth to fund endless wars. This is an amazing thing, and it is actually enabling one of the other fastest growing trends in the world. No, I'm not talking about Bitcoin. Bitcoin is the fastest growing trend in the world. It's growing even faster than the internet, which was one of the fastest adopted technologies in the history of technological adoption curves. But I'm actually talking about the trend of digital nomads. Every single year, this number of digital nomads is increasing by 50%. Today, there's over 35 million digital nomads all around the world. And I believe we are watching the 1997 prophecy of the sovereign individual unfold before our very eyes. And I actually went to a country that is at the forefront of the sovereign individual thesis, which of course is El Salvador. If you haven't seen the video I did about my 1-year journey in El Salvador, recommend you check out the video right there. But if you want to actually learn a little bit more about the sovereign individual, I also had the one and the only CK Snarks on the podcast to discuss a little bit more about the sovereign individual thesis. You can check that video out right there. And with all that said, I really hope you guys enjoyed this one, and I'll see you all in the next one.